So again, welcome. My name is Megan Walters. I work for the World Food Prize Foundation. This is the breakout session, the history behind the calls for housing justice during our 2020 Iowa Hunger Summit. We're so excited to have you all here today. The goal of the breakout sessions are to be a little bit more interactive than in the morning. Of course, we all miss you in person, but I think this is going to be a great virtual session. If you could start the beginning of this meeting on mute, we'd really appreciate it to make sure we can hear our speakers. And with that, I would like to introduce our speakers. With us today, we have Lauren Johnson. Lauren is the Policy and Communications Director for the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. She is responsible for developing and leading strategic initiatives, translating research and housing policy into informational understanding, developing contracts and agreements to work with housing programs, and serving as a point for grantees. Lauren also manages community relations, events, social media, and media relations, and was a summer intern for Polk Housing Trust Fund 2 years before joining the team full-time. Lauren's received 2 bachelor degrees from the College of Charleston in political science and music, and served as a member of the American Politics Research Team at the College of Charleston, with 2 papers being published in the journal Research and Politics in 2018 and 2019. Along with Lauren, we have Kendall Larson. Kendall is the Director of Research and Planning for the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. Kendall earned her master's degree in city/urban community and regional planning from Iowa State University, with a focus on social justice and equity planning, and her bachelor's degree from Gustavus Adolphus College, with a degree in history and a minor in sociology and anthropology. Her role at PCHTF focuses on providing research, analysis, writing, and design services to help educate and advocate for housing affordability in Central Iowa. So with that, join me in welcoming our speakers today. We're so excited to have you, Lauren and Kendall.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. We're excited to be here.
I'll get our screen share going, and then we can do that first poll of the.
Yeah.
Oh dear, good old screen share issues, of course.
Doesn't matter how many times you practice. No, this is perfect. We still got poll questions coming in. So if everyone wants to look, the question on your screen should be, have you seen or heard about the Undesigned, the Redline project? Looks like we have a couple of people, 5 more people, yet you can respond. Right. We're waiting on 2 people. I'll give you maybe another 5 seconds while we get there we go. Kendall, we see your screen. That looks great.
Perfect.
All right.
All right.
And well, we're almost split down the middle, but it looks like we have slightly less people who have seen or heard about the Undesigned, the Redline project. So we're really excited to spend this time with you today to just talk to you a little bit about what the Polk County Housing Trust Fund's been up to, what the Undesigned, the Redline project is, and most importantly, what this has to do with food insecurity or security in our community. And so, as Megan so eloquently stated up front, my name is Lauren Johnson, and I'm the Director of Policy and Communications for the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. Very excited to spend this time with you. I'm going to kick us off with just an overview of what the Polk County Housing Trust Fund is and what this Undesigned, the Redline project is as well, before kicking it over to Kendall for the bulk of the information we'll be sharing today. So thank you again for your interest in this really interesting and engaging topic. So the Polk County Housing Trust Fund is an independent nonprofit here in, of course, Polk County. And we really have 3 separate areas of focus at our organization. The first area of focus is funding, and we do that in a few different ways. And so the funding goes first to bricks and mortar dollars. So this is really making sure that we are keeping up with the demand for affordable housing in our community across the income spectrum. When we talk about affordable housing, really what this refers to is a person or a household or a family spending 30% or less of their monthly income on their housing costs. So that can either be rent or mortgage costs, as well as utilities. And so a lot of our funding goes towards just building more units across Polk County so that we can keep housing as affordable for everyone in our population as possible. The second branch of funding at the Polk County Housing Trust Fund actually comes from our annual campaign. And so our campaign dollars go towards programs and supportive services. So what these services do are really, the goal of these services is to get folks into permanent housing and to keep folks in that housing. And so there are many services that go alongside that for folks that are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And so we are so fortunate to have so many partners across the county and across the Polk County Metro that provide these services. So think of places like Anawim Housing, Home Inc., Habitat for Humanity, and many, many more. And so all of the money that we bring in our annual campaign goes to support their programs. The second area of focus for us is research and planning work. So of course, Kendall Larson is our director of research and planning. So this is really her domain. And the reason we focus on research and planning is so that we better understand the need in Polk County, really taking a deep dive into the data so that we can do two things. One, better allocate our dollars to the places that need them most and to the populations that need them most. And two, so that we can do our advocacy and policy work better. And that is our third area of focus at the Trust Fund. And so what we aim to do in this is really inform the public as well as inform our elected officials as to what our community looks like based on the data, what our incoming population is going to look like, and what we suggest as the best housing policies to go forward. So this really happens at the local level, think zoning codes. At the state level, think allocations as far as state funding goes to housing trust funds and things of that sort, tax credit policies and things like that. And then at the federal level, once again, a lot of that work is tax credits and funding. And so in that research and planning and advocacy and policy sphere, we really have started in the past about 2 years to focus on this issue of housing equity. Equity is spoken about a lot. And as we started to really see a disparity in the access to safe, stable, and affordable housing between our Black population and our white population, we decided to take a deeper look into why that was occurring. And so that led us to this Undesigned the Redline project. And so the Undesigned the Redline project was first brought to the city of Des Moines in April of 2019. We brought this project as part of our annual Affordable Housing Week and kept it up for a week as kind of a pop-up exhibit, which provided a national overview of the history of redlining in the United States of America. And so this exhibit has been placed in many, many different cities of varying sizes across the United States. Think cities as big as Los Angeles and New York, and cities of comparable size, just like Omaha, our neighbors over there to the west. They have also had this exhibit. And the exhibit was created by a social impact firm out of New York City called Designing the We. And they've been doing this work and really doing the work to understand this issue on many different levels for about 5 years now. So after in April 2019, we had the very general exhibit open to the public because of the wide reception that we got to that and the encouraging response from the community. And really that response was just an appetite for more information. We decided to take the steps necessary and more importantly, do the research that was necessary to localize this exhibit to Des Moines. And so in the fall and winter of 2019, Kendall and our friends over at Designing the We did that research that was necessary to better understand what these policies looked like from the 1930s and even a little bit before, but really from the 1930s to current day, and how this has unraveled and how this has left us with the disparities in housing that we see now. And so with that, I will go ahead and toss it over to Kendall to really talk about what redlining is, and once again, most importantly, how it intersects with food security and insecurity in our community.
Perfect. Thanks, Lauren. And We also want to mention you feel free to put questions into the chat as well, because we'll have Lauren as well as Megan just keep tabs on those as we go through. Some of them may be able to be answered right in the chat by Lauren, or we'll answer maybe some of those larger questions that may be asked at the end of the presentation. And so just to start out with, I'll be going over the Undesigned the Redline project, really answering this question and helping you better understand what is redlining and its actual impact on the city of Des Moines in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then also looking at the legacy of what that impact is today. And so to start out, what is redlining? So redlining was essentially a mortgage lending system that was established in the 1930s by President Roosevelt and Congress as they were putting together the New Deal era programs. And so these were social safety net and wealth building programs that the United States government were putting together to help bring the United States out of the Great Depression. And so one of the ways that we see this being implemented is in the housing sphere. And so in 1933, the Homeowners Loan Act is put into effect as kind of one of the first major New Deal era programs. And this creates the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially is an organization that is an emergency fund to help bring banks and lenders that are in debt out of the Great Depression, help them to refinance their loans, and allow also homeowners at this point in time get out of the fear of foreclosure. And so this is a really successful program. And so by 1934, the National Housing Act of 1934 is put into effect. And this is really the first time that the United States government is putting federal money into the mortgage lending system in the United States and being successful. And so this is also then the first time that the federal government is being put in the middle of the home ownership process in the United States. As part of the National Housing Act, the Federal Housing Administration is developed. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration then work together to create the system that we now call redlining. It was not, of course, called redlining when it was being established, but that's what we call it now because they created these maps that were residential security maps and risk assessment maps that are now what we call redlining maps. And so as part of the Federal Housing Administration, they also create the 30-year mortgage. Before this point in time, kind of your average American family was not able to own a home because it was way too expensive and there were really high interest rates. All of the loans were really short term. And so it was really hard for the average American to even own a home. And so what the 30-year mortgage and the Federal Housing Administration does is that they create these really long-term loans that have really low interest rates, which allows for more Americans, lower income Americans, to get into the structures of home ownership. And so essentially what they do is they create the American dream and make the American dream more successful to more people across the United States. But we have to remember that at this point in time, Jim Crow era segregation is still being implemented across all levels of government, and this doesn't skip over this system. And so Congress is wanting to bake into all of these social safety net and wealth building programs systemic ways to cut out people of color from benefiting from them. And so this is how Jim Crow era segregation is brought into the structures of home ownership through this mortgage lending system we now call redlining. And so these maps, these redlining maps, once called residential security maps, when they were created, there was no real easy way to assess the risk of individual borrowers. And so the Federal Housing Administration says that, we essentially need to be able to assess that risk. Individuals didn't have credit scores like we do today. And so the best way to do that was essentially putting credit scores on individual neighborhoods. So what they did was created these color-coded maps for 239 cities across the United States, which went from A, B, C, and D, or green, blue, yellow, and red. And these then corresponded to the risk level. So the best areas, good areas, declining areas, and hazardous. And so you can see that on the screen there. And these are just a few examples from around the country, as well as 2 places from Iowa, Sioux City and Waterloo. And we'll also take a look at the next slide in just a moment, which looks at the city of Des Moines map. But these maps then use this color-coded system to essentially say, these are the best areas, this is where loans should be put, this is where federally backed loans should be put and where they shouldn't. So for instance, the green and blue areas were the low risk areas. This is where you also had higher income groups, so more middle and upper middle class families living in these areas. And because they were low risk, the banks were told by the federal government, this is where you should be pushing your best loans in these areas. Continue to put a lot of investment into these green and blue areas and make sure that the people who are living there are essentially white. So this is where we see a lot of the white population living. The yellow areas were termed to be declining areas, and they were seen as declining for a variety of reasons, but one of the major reasons was the diversity, both in terms of economic class and in terms of ethnic and racial diversity. And so these areas were given this higher risk rating because of that diversity. And so banks were warned and cautioned about where they should be putting money into these neighborhoods. The federal government says, just don't put your best loans in these areas, just give your most basic average loans to white families in specific areas of these yellow neighborhoods. And so with that, then we have the red areas, or termed hazardous neighborhoods. And they're really termed hazardous because of the ethnic and racial composition, as well as these are where we have the lowest income classes living. These hazardous neighborhoods were the highest risk, and this is where banks told them no federally backed loans could be put into these neighborhoods. And so banks, because they were essentially reliant on federal funding at this point, meant that no money was going into these neighborhoods, no loans were going into these neighborhoods from lenders. And so what occurs then is that because they're completely cut off from federally backed home loans in these neighborhoods, then that allows for predatory lending and predatory banking, subprime lending to come into these neighborhoods and start a cycle of wealth extraction from the families who still want to access home ownership but don't have the best legal means to be able to do that. And also in these hazardous neighborhoods, we hear the term a lot, hazardous populations being used. And these hazardous populations are these groups that essentially the government wanted to keep away from white populations. So this included Italians, the Irish, Jews, Eastern European immigrants, Hispanic and Asian populations, and African Americans. So it was a very large group considered to be hazardous because at this point in time, these groups were not considered to be white by the federal definition. That, of course, changes at the end of World War II when Italians, Irish, and Jews, and some groups of Eastern Europeans it changes and they're considered to be white in the United States. But with that, then all of these groups are cut off from accessing federally backed home loans. And this was really done, these maps were produced by out-of-work real estate speculators and lenders that were on the local working in a local setting to help the government produce these maps. And now we'll take a look at the city of Des Moines map just for you all to see. But you can see that really on the east side of the Des Moines River, there's a lot of red and yellow. And then on the west side of the river is that big kind of A1 green section and multiple blue sections around it. That's really where we see most of the green on the city of Des Moines map. We also know that in these neighborhoods, especially the A neighborhoods, there was a lot of racially restrictive covenants and racially restrictive deeds that it was a whites only neighborhood, or those individual houses could only be sold to quote unquote, the Caucasian race. And so we see those being put in deeds in A1 areas, as well as we have this A2 section right here. This is Chautauqua Park. And Chautauqua Park, when it was being developed in the 1920s, had a racially restrictive covenant on the entire neighborhood. It was a whites only neighborhood. And so that covenant was implemented and used all the way into the 1950s. And even though when it was essentially outlawed by the federal government, it was still in the individuals that live there still use that covenant to try to persuade certain groups not to live there. And so we see that, you know, taking effect and really having a lasting impact, even just on Chautauqua Park compared to the neighborhoods just south of it. There's a lot more investment that has gone into Chautauqua Park over time compared to the other neighborhoods, the yellow and red neighborhoods below it. And so kind of what the general impact at this point in time from the 1940s all the way until the 1970s especially was all of those racially restrictive covenants and deeds being implemented across the city and creating segregated neighborhoods, as well as the implementation of the big federal programs of urban renewal and freeway construction. We have in the 1950s, right before the freeway construction was about to start, that Des Moines was almost 100% segregated in the 1950s. That was talked. There was an article which that image right on the farthest side of right-hand side of the screen shows you where you have the African American population living in the 1950s. And the article talks about how it's almost, Des Moines has almost accomplished 100% segregation. There also were racially restrictive covenants and deeds being used and discrimination in the advertisements of selling of plots of lands through the 1930s and into the 40s, that developments would only be developed for African, or not for African Americans, just for white families. And you also have during the 1960s and 70s with urban renewal, as well as with the freeway construction, that where the freeway came through essentially were these once redlined neighborhoods, and where we see the majority of the lower income and minority populations living. And so what it does is it completely disrupts and destroys the African American, specifically the African American community. And one of the places destroyed was Center Street. Center Street was a major economic center for the city of Des Moines. Especially, it was all Black-owned businesses along Center Street, and a lot of Black entrepreneurship. You had jazz clubs, social clubs, you had pharmacies, funeral homes, everything you can imagine was there, and it was Black-owned. It was the heart and soul of the Black economy in central Iowa, and the heart and soul of the Black community just in general. And it was completely wiped out. I think there's only maybe 2 buildings that were original to Center Street still standing today. But essentially everything was wiped out, and half of the Center Street neighborhood, the housing, was also wiped out. And so what we've heard today is that a lot of the what we see in Black entrepreneurship today and Black business owners today has still not reached the level that it was back in the 40s and 50s and 60s when Center Street existed. So that hasn't ever recovered. And so during that time of urban renewal and the kind of the rise of suburbia with the freeway construction as well, we have the City of Des Moines Commission on Human Rights putting out this quote in 1961 about the impact of that. And I'll just read it here quickly. It reads that Negroes have been almost totally excluded from the purchase or rental of the 15,379 homes built by private enterprise since World War II. At this writing, no builder will sell a Negro a house in any development now in progress, and 86% of all Negro households in Des Moines are located in our most rundown sections of our city. And so you can see the impact that federal policies had locally on the city of Des Moines in the creation of things like the white suburbs. And so as we jump to present day and look at the legacy and impact of that, but we still see areas of high concentration, both in terms of our white and Black population. So you can see there, the color got messed up there, but the orange represents the white population and the dark green represents the African American population. And so you can see that kind of generally between MLK, Hickman, and University, we still see the highest concentration of our African American population living within those neighborhoods. And if you think back to that map from 1950, those are still the areas that were once 100% segregated, are still the areas where we see those populations living. We also see concentrations of poverty in those same neighborhoods as well in Des Moines. As you can see on that map there. We also can see the where we have location of both low property conditions. As you can see on this map here, the red and orange and some of the yellow represent very low condition properties. And these, again, you can see in kind of that central area, not just low conditions, but also then low property values as well, are in those same areas where we see the concentration of low income as well as our African American population living. We also have large inequalities, as a lot of you know, who are on this call, but specifically in the housing realm, African Americans are denied loans at a rate that's 2.2 times higher than the Polk County average, which actually increased from the last time this report, the One Economy report, was put out in 2017. It's increased. And then also going back to those property values that we just looked at, there's a big difference between the median value of single family homes across Polk County from all census tracts to minority census tracts. There's a large gap in the value of those properties. And then also when we're looking at rentership versus home ownership, in Polk County, about 69% of the Black population rent their homes, which is then only compared to about 33% of the general population across Polk County. And then of that 69%, about 53, so over half of African Americans are cost burdened, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their rent, of their income towards rent and utilities. So that is a very high percentage of the population that is renting. And then on the home ownership side, African Americans represent only 2.6% of the homeowners across Polk County, which is very, very low. We also see just other impacts on the city of Des Moines, especially how we're seeing our cities develop and when revitalization is occurring. So the Blitz on Blight program that's been going on for over a year now, a lot of the kind of worst case scenario buildings that are seen and brought up to this Blitz on Blight program are in those areas that have been disinvested in for decades, and those areas where we see our highest concentration of our African American population and our low income population. We also see that where we have this disinvestment has influenced where revitalization occurs across the United States, across the city of Des Moines. And so, for instance, we have things like the project of Invest DSM going on, looking at where they looked at the neighborhood healthiness, and where we see the most unhealthy neighborhoods are those areas, I'm being very repetitive, but those areas where we see those concentrations still of our African American population and our low income population are seen to be the worst parts of the city. And again, going back to that 1961 quote that I read from the Commission of Human Rights, we still see that a large majority of our minority population are living in the worst parts of the city by this definition here, or by this map. And so for instance, with the Invest DSM program, we're seeing that the neighborhoods that were chosen to be the start of the Invest DSM revitalization program are these 4 neighborhoods of Oak Park and Highland Park, Drake, Franklin, and Columbus Park. And of these areas, a lot of them were not seen as kind of the worst parts of the city. They're not the most unhealthy neighborhoods. They are some of ones that are still good neighborhoods. And so essentially what we see is that there's investment going into neighborhoods that is still good, and no investment going into neighborhoods that are seen as kind of the worst, the most unhealthy neighborhoods. So it's just continuing the cycle of disinvestment into these neighborhoods that were targeted, 80 years ago to be these kind of worst places where the minority and hazardous populations should live. And so also we then see that, we have gentrification happening across the country in areas that are surrounding places like downtowns. And so when we're looking specifically at housing development across our cities, we see that downtowns have been shifting over the last 15 years, where a lot of money is going into downtowns to revitalize them, to make them more welcoming for people and bring people back in. And that's then impacting those neighborhoods around them, which were once redlined neighborhoods. And so then we start to see places like, for instance, with Sherman Hill having outrageous prices on there, not outrageous, but higher prices than they would have a long time ago. These were areas like Sherman Hill was a large minority community, African-American community, and had a lot of affordability. And now that has been starting to change, as well as places like the East Village. That's where we saw a lot of affordability, 40 years ago being put into the East Village area. We still had a lot of refugee populations as well as other minority populations living in the East Village. And now there's condos going all the way being sold for $700,000 and rent is over $2,500 a month. So a lot of people are being displaced because of this gentrification, essentially. And then also in the actual development of affordable housing, we also, we also see that a lot of the affordable housing projects, or the funding that comes from LIHTC or other subsidized projects, are being put into once redlined and yellow neighborhoods. So they're essentially allowing this kind of cycle of segregation and creating segregated neighborhoods for low-income populations to be kept in specific areas of the city. And so that then again allows to then this continuation of these policies that still have an effect on our city today. Again, confining low-income and minority populations to specific parts of the city. And so now we'll transition on to the second part of the presentation here. And I think we have one poll now to get your feedback.
All right, so y'all should have just seen a question pop up on your screen. The question is, do you think this history has an impact on food access in cities? Your optional responses are yes, very much, maybe, somewhat, not at all, or unsure. Let us know. It looks like we have about 86% of people have responded so far. We'll give you a few more seconds to think about it. All right.
Yes, definitely looks like everybody has, it's either yes, very much, or maybe. And so now we'll take a look and see if you guys are right. So yes, so what does this have to do with food insecurity and access? Well, there is a very strong relationship between the practice of redlining and food insecurity and food access. And so we see that formerly redlined neighborhoods still have, again, the concentration of low income and minority populations across the country, and that predominantly low income Black neighborhoods face the most limited access to quality food. And so we see that there are a lot of these neighborhoods that are low income neighborhoods that have been continued to be disinvested from the time that redlining was put into law, that these are still areas where there's a lot of difficulties to obtain fresh fruits and vegetables and other healthy foods compared to non-minority neighborhoods. And so that is a big part of this as well. We also see that due to the disinvestment, high quality food options in supermarkets are less likely to be available in these neighborhoods, and low conditions and disinvestment lead to stores not wanting to build or locate in these neighborhoods. And so that's a really big problem, because then that helps to then create food deserts. And so there's a quote on this next slide that I broke up a little bit so it's easier to read, but I'll just read this out loud because I thought that it was impactful and really talks about this topic. So living patterns are correlated with access to educational opportunities, employment opportunities, and ultimately to the health of those living within a community. One factor influencing the health of individuals is access to affordable, nutritious foods. Studies comparing specific neighborhoods have found that low-income neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods are less likely to have access to large supermarkets. Federal and state policies have influenced the evolution of supermarkets and their relative scarcity in low-income and minority communities, just as they have influenced segregated living patterns. And so with that, one thing that we've been seeing since the 1960s, going along with the development of the suburban communities, is that there's this process now that is coined supermarket redlining. So supermarket redlining is a term used to describe a phenomenon where major chain supermarkets are disinclined to locate their stores in inner cities or low-income neighborhoods, and usually pull their existing stores out and relocate them to the suburbs. Part of this is due to square footage sizes. It's harder to find areas in low-income neighborhoods as well as in more urban settings to have 50,000 square feet of property to be able to build a supermarket. And also, again, the conditions of a neighborhood deter supermarkets from wanting to go there, because then that correlates in a lot of areas, or even just stereotypically, with higher crime rates. And a lot of businesses don't want to move to those areas where there's a perceived sense of higher crime. So that plays into it as well. And so again, since the 1960s, supermarkets began taking their supermarkets out of urban low-income communities and moving out with white flight into the suburbs. And the grocery stores and retailers fled to the suburbs, and upon relocation to the suburbs, supermarkets shifted from specialty stores like meat markets and bakeries and produce shops, and then created into all one big thing that we know today, these massive supermarkets, which then was at a disadvantage for people living in urban communities where it had those individual markets that some of them didn't have access to a lot of the different produce, the fresh foods in the convenience stores and such like that. There isn't that access anymore because of the supermarkets. And so we see that city supermarkets and specialty stores found it really hard to compete with suburban stores due to, again, the land requirements. And there was a lot of really strict city zoning laws. And this also then led to the problem of lack of investment into new stores and the relocation of stores and difficulty of access and availability, again, to healthy food choices. And so the kind of lasting impact of these issues, I just have a quick video after this slide that follows one woman's struggle to get to a grocery store to find good food. But what we see is that there's different levels of food insecurity, and Black and Hispanic families are kind of on the higher end of that, as you can see on that image there. But smaller convenience stores and grocery stores are really necessary to have in those neighborhoods, in urban neighborhoods for low-income populations. But some of them have really high pricing, so it's not affordable, or a lot of convenience stores don't have the don't sell the really healthy foods that then are better for us to eat, right? And so that then leads in these neighborhoods to higher health issues like obesity, higher blood pressure, asthma, high cholesterol, diabetes, etc. And that, again, there's this really high cost of the cost of living and the cost of healthy foods compared to less healthy foods that people who can't afford to, even in some of those neighborhood supermarkets, may be not able to afford the fresh produce in those areas because they have raised up the price. And so ignoring past influences constraining the choice of minority of minorities redirects attention from social constraints imposed by institutions on minorities to minorities' personal choice. So there's a lot around the narrative that essentially are saying this is the people have the choice, and it's their personal choices not to go find this good food. But in reality, it's because of zoning laws and federal policies and state policies that have incentivized supermarkets and other things to either raise their prices to be able to be sustainable in an urban setting, or move out and vacate their properties in urban settings and move out to suburban communities. And so that then limits the accessibility of good, healthy foods to minority and low income neighborhoods. And so we'll play this as it'll pop up. This is from NPR. It's looking at Washington, D.C., as you can see. And so I'll look at Megan just to make sure that the all of the noise is coming through, all of the sound is coming through, but I'll start it now.
I forgot the bag.
This is Tony Lawson.
Oh, no, start, please.
I forgot the bag.
This is Tony Lawson. She lives in the southeast part of Washington, D.C., a predominantly poor
I
neighborhood.
forgot the bag.
Your bag?
Yeah, the
You
shopping
want to
bag.
go grab it?
Yeah, cause I don't have any money to buy bags.
Okay.
If, like Tony, you live in a lower income community, have no access to a vehicle, and live more than a half a mile away from the grocery store, you live in a food desert.
Try not to miss the bus.
Tony retired from a career in the insurance industry 10 years ago and receives food stamps on the 6th of every month.
I don't think this was an accident, not to build grocery stores in this area because the people here, it's not just about black people, it's about poor people.
Route A4, destination.
Tony is one of more than 23.5 million Americans who live in a neighborhood which the USDA calls a food desert. That means they have limited access to healthy, fresh, and affordable food. For Tony, getting groceries requires traveling 2 miles with the help of 2 buses. It takes 40 minutes each way. It's a struggle to get there, especially when you're 71 and have to carry a week's worth of groceries back home without a car. In Washington, more than 80% of food deserts are located in the neighborhoods with the highest poverty rates, and where mostly black residents live. In whiter and wealthier parts of town, there are plenty of big box grocery stores and independently owned supermarkets. But in Southeast DC, leading chains don't feel like there's enough money to be made in those poorer neighborhoods. The higher rate of crime in Southeast is another deterrent. So if you want to buy food in Southeast DC, you generally have to get fast food or go to a convenience store. That leaves 150,000 people in the area in a food desert.
Now we're calling it what it is, food apartheid. It's something that's planned. The desert is natural. It's manufactured by the planet. This is something that's planned. And it's obvious.
Tony buys her food from multiple grocery stores, searching for the best deals. Here she is at Giant, her closest grocery store, trying to find some staples on sale.
There are not a lot of places in the area where I live that I can go and buy food. What I do is I get my bulk when I get my stamps. I run all over the city. Even though the Giant is here, I don't patronize the Giant very often because it's expensive. So I'm running all over the city.
Tony is tired of traveling across the city hunting for food. She wants more healthy food options for everyone in the neighborhood. So she's training to be a community advocate, pressing the DC government to provide incentives that will attract more grocery stores to come here. Her goal is simple.
I've been in Ward 8 21 years, and we have not had a full-service supermarket for that entire time. There's always been a break. In my area, I want to see more places for people to shop.
For NPR, I'm Sasha Ann Simons in Washington.
Perfect. So just a example from Washington, D.C. And as I was reading through some of the comments as well on the YouTube, video, some people said, and part of what's possible in Washington, D.C. is that they have a really good public transportation system. Even though it takes a long time and and it's really far away, they have access to good public transportation, whereas other places in the country have these same issues, but they don't have access to good public transportation. So it's even harder, right? And so before we get to the last part, which Lauren will wrap up for us, when we're looking specifically at the city of Des Moines and looking at the DMARC pantries, for instance, these are, we see that a lot of the pantries, both the physical pantries and then the mobile pantries as well, are really working in these areas that are food deserts, right? Are these areas that they don't have access to big supermarkets or good healthy foods, and they are working in once redlined neighborhoods because that access is not there to those foods. So we're really grateful, right, to have DMARC being able to try to make up for some of these lacking efforts from big market supermarkets. And so with that, Lauren will talk a little bit about what our work is doing to try to address the larger housing inequities that we see through our Undesigned the Redline project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kendall. And, as we have gone through today extensively, and as we talk about, every time we talk about the issue of redlining, is really that housing touches every aspect of our lives, because, it is your center of gravity in your life. And as you can see through that video, it very much impacts your access to food and what kind of food you're going to get. This is no news for this crowd, but there are so many other areas as well that housing touches. For example, education, childcare, healthcare, where you can go to the clinic. It's really important in order to address all of these issues of inequity in our community, to address where folks have the opportunity to live, and furthermore, ensure that people have the levity to make that choice as to where they would like to live. So kind of backing up a little bit from this, or I guess stepping down from the soapbox, to talk a little bit more specifically about what we are doing to address this issue here in Polk County, and more specifically in the city of Des Moines and the Des Moines Metro. So we really believe that education is the first step to first understanding and then addressing these issues of inequity. And so that's why, starting in January of 2020, we've been giving these presentations. Of course, come March, we had to transition them to virtual presentations like we're doing today. But we're so grateful to have reached so many people throughout the community to explain what this issue is and how it's impacted the development and the landscape of American cities, including the city of Des Moines. So really, education is step one in this process of bringing about change in our community. And on that note, maybe Kendall can drop it in the chat. We do have a 5-part series that dives very deeply into the issue of redlining in the city of Des Moines. They come out every Tuesday. So the first 2 are out, and the next 3 will come out in the remaining 3 weeks up until November 10th. And so that's a really great resource to learn more about this history and to share it with friends and family and colleagues who may be interested as well. So the second step to addressing this is really robust community engagement. So this does not just mean, thinking of community engagement as a box to check in the process of undergoing a new project, but thinking of it as an opportunity to really broaden our perspective as to what the community really wants. So, rather than implementing certain policies in a place because you think that might be the best thing for its residents, well, take the time and the effort and the energy to really talk to those residents to better understand what they think the best solutions could be. Because, nobody knows better than the folks who are living in that area as to how the area could improve over time. And so really taking the time to, obviously now do it virtually, but to meet with folks where they are, and to understand what their needs are as a community. And that really just props up the community as a whole and props up the region as a whole if we are much more inclusive in those engagement strategies. And so as part of that, really the Undesigned Part 2 process is that we understand as a housing organization that the key to solving the issues that have popped up in this city specifically because of the policy of redlining is not probably just housing focused, right? This issue is much broader than that. And so that's why we are now forming a coalition of folks and different organizations to do that community engagement process so that we can better understand how to go forward. And so that we can come up with strategies to address these inequities, not only in housing, but also as it pertains to food insecurity, also as it pertains to food deserts, education, economic mobility is a big one. And so because of the community engagement strategies that will be implemented, most likely in 2021, we will have better guidance into how we invest into these communities in a way that is not gentrifying these communities, but also how we can bring about policy change as well to make things more equitable for all of us and really put us in a good position going forward into the future. And so we're really excited about the steps that are being taken, but we really need your help in that education part. So if you can share all of that standard mumbo jumbo as far as it goes to these educational videos so that we have really a base level of understanding across the community as to what this issue has done to the city of Des Moines, we will be much farther ahead in how to address this issue in the city of Des Moines.